Welcome, everyone, to Catalista's 2 Minutes to Midnight, an extravaganza. My name is Henry Coleman, coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. 2M2M is a deep dive into how the world works. In Season 1, we explore a book that connects the dots between accelerating computing power, capitalism, and democracy. It's called People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy, by Robert McChesney and John Nichols. We're ready to plunge back into Chapter 1 of People Get Ready, into the maelstrom. This episode divides between two parts: democratic infrastructure and the real F-bomb. So what is democratic infrastructure? Think of it as the frame that holds a democratic house upright. Here's a bit about democratic infrastructure from the book. A credible democratic infrastructure requires ground rules and institutions that empower the weakest in society, so they can effectively be the political equals of the wealthiest members of society. And that prevents the wealthy from having excessive influence. It also includes breakers, to prevent the establishment of such proven enemies of democracy as corruption, private monopolistic control over the economy, significant economic inequality, government secrecy, surveillance, and militarism. We have 5 wonderful guests to speak with on this episode. Let's begin by letting each of them describe how they frame world affairs. Alexandria Shana is a sailor, writer, organizer, and activist. Based in the Southern Caribbean, she's an instructor at the School for Social and Cultural Change and is active with the organizations Real Utopia and the Climate Reality Project. She's an author and contributor to Common Dreams, LA Progressive, and Counterpunch. Alexandria, how do you describe your perspective as a commentator on current affairs?
I've been involved in education, community organizing, and environmental work in various ways for most of my life. I'm a member of Real Utopia, Foundation for a Participatory Society. We're living in a time when people already know that things are broken, whether it's our economy, healthcare, electoral process, education, social conditions, it's all upside down and broken. And whether you're apolitical, left, right, or center, you know it. We might not agree on how we got here or who is to blame, but we all know that it isn't working. So for me, criticism is one part of creating change, but it's not enough. So to move beyond criticism into something more constructive, something that gives strategic direction and also hope, we must have a serious answer to the question of not just what you don't like, but what do you want? We need a worthy vision, which is why I'm involved in advocating and organizing for participatory society, seeking revolutionary change, socially, economic, environmental. It all requires us to envision what we want, to continually collaborate and to refine our ideas and to work strategically to get there. Without vision, real, attainable, inspiring vision, we tend to mistake tactics for strategy. It leads us to fight one battle to the next and too often fail to see the clear path ahead. So we as the movement and we as individuals end up suffering fatigue. We squabble between each other and just generally fail to inspire for our cause. So my perspective is to reject the wrongs of today, but armed with a clear vision for tomorrow. And that's a mass movement calling for participatory society.
Lina Atala is co-founder and chief editor of Mada Masr, an online news organization at the forefront of investigative journalism in Egypt. She leads a team of reporters who expose high-level corruption and misconduct in the midst of the country's harsh crackdown on independent voices. Time magazine named her one of the world's 100 most influential people in 2020. Lina, tell us about your perspective as an observer on world affairs.
I'm a journalist as a practice and as a way of navigating politics. My journalism is not just a profession. It's been my decision to engage with politics through the lens of journalism. Why? Because I feel that in a hypermediated world, we are increasingly invited to know because of the surrounding technologies, because we're all on the internet. At the same time, in parallel to that, we're constantly disinvited from taking active part in making change or in shaping up the decisions that govern our lives. We have these twin realities coming together with a lot of incompatibility. And my choice to be a journalist has to do with how can we be more informed, more analytical, more deconstructivist in our approach to the thick realities surrounding us in order to have informed positions about things. So I feel that in the world we live in, the information that's channeled to us is channeled with a lot of filters naturally, in the sense that we are in very subtle and invisible ways, and sometimes less subtle and sometimes less invisible. We are told how to consume this information, what to believe out of this information. I am interested in breaking down the hegemony through which information is reaching us in such a way where we craft positions that are already sort of pre-told or dictated. I'm interested in the possibility of reaching new realities and new possibilities through the information that surrounds us, as opposed to being fed how this information should be consumed.
Aaron Good has a PhD in political science from Temple University. His book, American Exception, explains the breakdown of US democracy by taking a deep politics approach to the evolution of the American state, while shedding light on political practices that usually go undiscussed. He's the host of the podcast, American Exception. Aaron, how did you come to your understanding of American politics?
I knew that there was something dark about this American system, and that got fleshed out more by reading about U.S. foreign policy and even books by pretty much liberal guy, Stephen Kinzer, but his critiques of foreign policy said that there was corporate interest driving these things. And so I was aware of that, even as I still worked on the Obama campaign and thought that he was going to actually change things after 8 years of George Bush, who seemed an administration that seemed overtly criminal, really. And so I thought that getting somebody else in there, they're in the opposite party, they would have every incentive to go after this criminal administration that had run things and then sort of restore the rule of law and so on, or so I thought. But that didn't happen, and that kind of radicalized me further. And one day in 2009, well, you had the Honduras coup, which Obama seemed to wink at, or at least accept after the fact in the most benign interpretation of that. And I thought, oh my God, this is the same thing. There's not going to be any change. He's just a different guy in front of the camera, but the state rolls on. So reflexively now, when something is going on, especially if it involves the U.S. overseas or U.S. foreign policy, I tend to think that I'm not being told the truth by the prevailing mass media organizations. And I keep getting proven correct with things like Libya and Syria and Russiagate and a lot of these things that have been debunked over time. But if you have an appropriately skeptical take of the regime that we live under, then that's a good starting point to go from. And so that's really how I look at current affairs these days, is from a very skeptical point of view.
Mark Crispin Miller is a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. He is the author of several books, including Boxed In, The Culture of TV, Cruel and Unusual, Bush and Cheney's New World Order, and Fooled Again, The Real Case for Electoral Reform. He's currently co-producing Four Died Trying, a documentary series on the assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Mark, tell us about your perspective as a commentator on current events, before and after COVID.
As a commentator on current events, I'm overwhelmed these days because the subject that I've been primarily concerned with for some time has become inescapable and all-pervasive and has struck many, many people who are not specialists at this kind of study as more urgent than anything else, really. And I'm referring to propaganda, which I have, or I should say I had taught a course on here at NYU for over 20 years. With the rollout of the virus a couple of years ago, the propaganda became really staggering, and it has continued to do so since then. The way I have been teaching propaganda is a little bit different from the way it tends to be taught in higher education. It tends to be taught as something that totalitarian societies excelled at. There's a lot of attention paid to what the Nazis did with it, what the Bolsheviks did with it. Maybe some discussion of the Allied propaganda in World War I, but the emphasis has tended to be on propaganda as an alien thing and as something that we don't do in the democracies. My approach, on the other hand, is to stress how propaganda is especially pervasive and effective in the so-called democracies. And that, at least as far as the Nazis were concerned, they were heavily influenced by the British propaganda in World War I. The Bolsheviks, not so much. But what I tell my students at the beginning of every semester is that we don't have a hard time discerning propaganda that we do not agree with. So we're always very quick to point the finger at the other side and say that's propaganda, which we use as a synonym for lying, although propaganda can actually be accurate. It's far more challenging to learn how to perceive propaganda that pushes your own buttons, which is to say, propaganda that tells you what you want to hear. I say this at the beginning in order to prepare them for some discomfort at times, because once you start to pay attention to what propaganda is and start to see how some of it that strikes you as true and right and good is actually false or half true or oversimple, once you begin to take that approach, you might be forced to move a little bit out of your comfort zone. And you will also invariably clash with family or friends when you tell them what you're studying. And since they have not been studying it, some of what you may tell them about your discoveries will upset them. So that's how I've approached it, with a fair amount of attention paid to propaganda in the past, but with the primary emphasis on propaganda in real time as it's affecting all of us. Now, that was a good question that you raised about the difference between my teaching it before and after COVID. In the fall of 2020, as I was giving that introductory lecture and giving it online because we were forced to teach remotely, I was coming up with examples of the kind of thing we would talk about in a course like this, and or the kind of thing that the students could write their papers on. I noted the way we were meeting. I said, look at how we're actually holding this class. You hate it. I hate it. Why are we doing this? Well, obviously, it's because of the COVID crisis. And the COVID crisis has been driven from the beginning, and remember, this was September of 2020, by a number of propaganda themes. Now, that doesn't mean that they're false necessarily, but it does tend to mean that they're maybe a little one-sided. So within the context of COVID, there are a number of things we could talk about as propaganda. One example that I came up with was the mask mandates. I said that if you were to write on propaganda, or if we were to discuss it in class, you would want to start by reading all the randomized controlled trials on the effectiveness of masking in hospitals. I thought there were 8. There were actually more than that. You would want to read those 8 studies because they have all found that masks do not prevent transmission of respiratory viruses, because the virions are too small and the masks are too porous. You'd want to read those studies. You would also want to read the more recent studies that have come out. This was in the summer of 2020, finding otherwise. You'd want to read all of them, everything, and then make up your own mind. Well, this point enraged one of the students who didn't say anything in the class, but who a few days later took to Twitter to demand that I be fired for putting the students at risk. And that was unpleasant. It wasn't that big a deal in itself, but what was kind of a big deal was that NYU essentially took her side in various ways. And I won't go on and on about this other than to say that I was subjected to a kind of a review of my conduct in the classroom that went on for over a year, I guess, and that ultimately cleared me of any wrongdoing. Most of my department colleagues, in demanding that review from the dean, wrote a letter accusing me of hate speech and attacks on students. I mean, it was craziness. I refuted their letter in detail and asked them to retract it. They refused, so I sued them for libel. The upshot of all this for my teaching has been that they won't let me teach the propaganda course anymore. and indeed have stopped offering it at all, I guess out of fear that I might ask to teach it if they offer it. So here's a course on propaganda that is taking into consideration the propaganda all around us at the moment. It's a course that I actually think is more important than it's ever been, precisely because of this constant blitzkrieg of propaganda that we're living under. And I was essentially punished for doing it. So that's what happened. I'm not allowed to teach it anymore at a moment when the students really need it more than ever.
Celia Farber is a journalist and author who has covered a range of topics for magazines including Spin, Rolling Stone, Esquire, Harper's, and the Epoch Times. She writes The Truth Barrier on Substack, investigating COVID, HIV, and anti-tyranny in all its forms. Celia is the author of Serious Adverse Events, An Uncensored History of AIDS. Celia, what informs your work as a journalist, particularly when it comes to the realm of pharma and the medical establishment?
Well, for so many years, there were a relative small number of us in this particular battle against pharmaceutical lies and psyop propaganda and murder, really is the word, killing people with their products in the name of new viruses said to be deadly. The first one was HIV and AIDS. It's not the first time that they launched a scare and attached pharmaceutical profits to it, not by far, but it really is the prelude to COVID. So my perspective now is one of shock and horror, and we never dreamed this situation would metastasize. We all used to think that HIV was singularly depraved. It was such a sick culture of science never having to be validated because it was HIV/AIDS. It was wholly sacred. And now we see that that was the test model, this situation where there's no science in it. There's just this other thing that I barely know how to name. It resembles a cult. It resembles the conditions of a cult, that you're not allowed to ask any questions. You're not allowed to leave. You're not allowed to question. The whole thing is rife with violence and threat. And there's no justice or democracy or fairness or decency or civility in any of it. So I guess it's fair to say that my perspective is one of finding myself vindicated and also very busy. People are very interested now in the history of HIV/AIDS, which, like I said, there were not that many of us, but we were a determined bunch. And we had a war, a real war that lasted a couple of decades with these people. And many got wiped out. We all got severely attacked, reputation attacked. I believe some people got eliminated. It was a very serious war that almost no Americans know about. And I have said, I think what was at stake in this war was the very soul of biology, the study of life. It was real terrorism. It was psychological terrorism. And we were all fighting for there to be some scientific foundation. But instead, they got people in this place that was beyond processing facts, beyond science. And they found that place. And then there was a lull, I guess, for several years. And we thought the worst was over. And then this thing descended. It's so shocking that I really struggle to find words for the situation we're in. It's beyond belief that this is happening.
Lena, Chapter 1 of People Get Ready talks about democratic infrastructure, meaning the institutions that support the possibility of a working democracy. In your estimation, what are key components that support a thriving democracy, especially when it comes to journalism?
If I want to speak from the narrow perspective, again, of what I do and what I practice and the way through which I navigate politics, I would say an important component is an environment where information is freely available and channeled without the nodes and the mediations of power structures that influence the way this information is channeled and received and consumed. So by structures of power, I primarily refer to states, but I also refer to big multinationals. And in the case of information, we're talking specifically about the big social media companies that are playing a major role in what information is reaching us in the first place and what information is not reaching us. So Facebook, Google, and so on and so forth. Another component for me is an open space where different political players, different forms and shapes are allowed to organize, assemble, and think together alone and together collectively. And it doesn't have to be restricted to parliaments, and it doesn't have to be restricted to official state institutions. The idea is to have what I like to call the political street. So bringing politics to the street and not confining it to the sites of institutions, and having different political players of all forms and shapes. So not necessarily the classical organized political parties, but the youth groups, the initiatives, the syndicates, the labor unions, quote unquote, informal workers, be able to practice politics actively in the Hannah Arendt sense. So not to just sit back and contemplate, but be in the vita activa or the active life. And a third thing that I think connects those two components together, basically the relationship of these people, of these different political players, of these subjects who we should only call citizens the moment they are actively practicing their political life. The relationship of these people, of these citizens to power structures, I feel is not one that should be reduced to the ranks of ballot boxes and representation. I think we've seen in recent years that representation-based democracy has become in many ways synonymous with the idea of people simply referring the political to power structures that represent them in a way or another, as opposed to them practicing politics actively. So how can the mechanisms of representation evolve in such ways where people continue to be active, to be more in the concrete, because we're not reinventing the wheel here. Experiences of citizens-based constitutional writing or constitutional amendment processes are there in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. How can these experiences be excavated, reactivated, learned from, basically activation of citizen councils on neighborhood level all the way up to the authorities? So that's another component that I always think is important to put on the table. And these are but elements without meaning to be at all comprehensive to what constitutes a sound democratic practice today.
Aaron, can we talk about responsibility and empowerment? What's the role and responsibility of a citizen in a democracy? What disempowers us from playing that role today?
Ideally, you would have a population with a number of informed groups who have an accurate understanding of their interests and can debate the major issues of their time, individuals who can relate their personal problems with the bigger structures in which they operate. An informed public, or you could even call them a series of publics or a system of many publics where people are debating in an informed way and organizing along ways to advance their interests, but with some sort of democratic mindset that they can be informed, they should be informed, and they should rationally debate how to advance their interests. One thing that has been astonishing to me is how, if you go back and read C. Wright Mills in the 1950s, The Power Elite was published in 1956, he identified these problems with American democracy that have only become much more salient since he first wrote about them in 1956, which is that the series of informed publics that would exist in democratic theory that debate things and then decide what policy should be, it's not really how it works. And what has been produced is a mass public of people that are largely detached from the real centers of power, who think that they don't really have much influence over things and are easily manipulated by the prevailing powers that be, what he called the power elite, which were the people who prevailed at the top of the military, political, and big business hierarchies in the US, which he saw as being increasingly concentrated in terms of their wealth and power. And he said pretty much that in the final summation, they were servants of the corporate rich. So it's really the corporate rich and the active members of the elite that occupy the top positions in these organizations, in the economy, the military, and the political system, that they're so intertwined that it's really problematic and that it's not so much a democracy anymore. The most important decisions are made at the top of this system, and we're largely not even privy to who makes them, and they're presented after the fact. I think that was a good critique in the 1950s, and it's only gotten worse in terms of the way that the population is befuddled by many things. I think that it's so striking the way that you have two parties that don't really represent the public interest, and they argue very bitterly about things in a way that's a giant spectacle. These spectacles are more transparently fabricated, and yet these are what citizens are devoting a lot of energy to, and the mass media is sort of fueling that. So there is not a responsible free press that holds power to account in the United States. There is a corporate-owned mass media that confuses the population. So what is the responsibility of the citizen in that? Well, America is a place that doesn't afford you a lot of economic security. So who has the resources to devote to being able to make sense of these things when the information you would need to make sense of them is not really readily available? You have to almost devote your life to these things. And even a lot of people that do spend their lives or a good portion of their time understanding politics end up falling into one of these camps that seem to have been created and curated by the powerful corporate forces that are profoundly anti-democratic. And so it falls on people doing what you're trying to do with this series and what I've tried to do with my academic work and with the podcast that I run to shine a light on the dark side of the prevailing order, because it's really essential if we want to have any chance to deal with what's coming. And these trends that you've been talking about of more automated future and mass unemployment and property rights that are held sacrosanct for this tiny minority of people, it looks like we're sort of headed towards a matrix kind of reality. In that context, these different policies that they're putting in place about more surveillance and tracking of different people in different ways are bad, whatever the justification is. If it's terrorism, if it's health related, biology related, vaccines, it's like, I don't see that the state that exists right now has much of a claim that they're really interested in protecting our well-being. And so we should be quite alarmed as they accumulate more and more powers and that the constitutional rights that we supposedly have are eroded in the name of protecting us, when these forces demonstrably have not really been working very hard to protect us. They seem more interested in protecting their own hegemony and exploiting the population indefinitely.
Celia, what is your take on present-day democracy in the United States?
The myth of democracy is that it's a rule by the people, for the people, that when the people object to their rulers, they can vote them out, that the people are essentially free from governmental persecution and assault unless they've committed a crime. Those are some of the concepts of democracy. Back in the days of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and Iron Curtain countries were still in existence, I used to think we lived in a democracy because we could come and go. We could leave the country, come back. They can't do that. That it was a democracy if you could express things that went contrary to the ruling state and apparatus and not be dragged out of your home in the middle of the night, killed or taken to a prison. In other words, democracy, I thought, was just elemental protection against totalitarianism. And I grew up in Sweden. My two democracies have been Sweden and the United States. Now, everything has morphed. Everything has morphed in a revolutionary, very shocking way. And we're completely tyrannized by the mass media and by simulated realities, which we are forced to adopt as realities. So that's even stranger than, previous notions of what it meant to have your freedom taken away. We don't have the freedom now to identify reality and share it amongst ourselves, but rather your reality, if it's different from a family member's reality, you may never speak to that person again. So we're in this weaponized new reality. It's the incarnation of the New World Order. It's the incarnation of something very beastly that we now know they were planning for a very long time. It's important what words we choose. I used to think New World Order was an iffy concept, many years ago. Now I see that that is quite literally the word that's like an incantation that they, the ruling powers, invoke over and over and over, starting in earnest, I think, with George Bush Sr., and continuing on. I was watching a video last night that collected a lot of snippets of the different presidents, and Klaus Schwab, all of them, Bill Clinton, they were all saying this thing that I never really heard before. I didn't really pick it up before. I didn't understand that they were building toward this dystopia.
So, in that context, is democracy still worth working towards? And if so, what is your vision of a working democracy, given your experience of the AIDS and COVID crises?
First of all, yes, democracy is by far the best system, I would say. So what I am here to unpack and show people and talk about is that your democracy and your hope for freedom and living in a democracy is only as strong as the next viral scare proclamation descending from Bill Gates, the WHO, Gavi, all these global institutions tied in with the banking system who decide that it's time for us to have a pandemic, who decide that it's time for us to have pandemic lockdown, for them to wipe out small businesses across America, for them to not allow children to go to school, and to not allow any of us to congregate, to breathe, or to even know anything about when we can be expected to have any kind of employment or social life anymore. That sounds to me like totalitarianism, and it was lived by us. So what we had was a descent into totalitarianism by way of a medical construct that was designed to deprive us of all of our freedoms virtually overnight. It was not a medical situation. It was a construct. It was a set of algorithms that came together that you could not protest. You could not say, for example, as you would be able to say in a democracy, I am a free sovereign person. I'm going to choose not to take your vaccine. I'm going to choose to keep my business open, and my patrons can tell me as the business owner whether they feel that's a reasonable risk for them to come in here even though nobody wears masks. That would be a free society. That would be a democracy. We lost that like that in 2020. And I feel that we lost that when Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx walked into Donald Trump's office and said, Mr. President, you're going to have to shut down the country because of COVID.
But from the perspective of media and many people, COVID was its kind of special case scenario where people needed to make sacrifices to benefit the greater good. What are your thoughts on that?
There was never a dialogue, which there must be in a democracy. Who decides what is risk, what is spread, what is unreasonable risk, and what is freedom in the context of that? There was no discussion. It came down preordained. Everything was preordained, including what made you a reasonable person, a good person, a bad person. Very few people would object to traditional disease prevention measures, such as have always been in place for tuberculosis and so forth. If you show up in the country and you have active tuberculosis, you have to be quarantined for a period of time. That's always been in place. And again, there is no major objection, maybe no objection hardly at all to such measures. This was something else. This was tyranny by way of first media scaremongering, extraordinarily well-planned and coordinated, executed media propaganda, exactly like it was with AIDS. So their first act is to propagandize and terrorize people day and night, day and night, day and night, until they are so frightened that they'll go along with anything. How do you abuse people into health? You know, I'm half Swedish. I listened to the press conferences from Sweden. At no point did they close a school. At no point did they mask a child. At no point did they tell their citizens that they could make other people sick if they were symptom-free. This is epidemiological lunacy, all of it. And this is what I learned my years on the HIV beat. They will say anything, the Fauci gang. They own the media, and the media will never question them. And it becomes this doctrine of what's called the science. And then they start bullying anybody who would beg to differ, no matter what their standing as a scientist, a doctor, an epidemiologist, what have you. This is all the playbook. This is all very familiar. So my experience now is that we're living in a medical tyranny.
Alexandria, in the face of rapidly accelerating technology, what do you think the role of government should be?
The role of government is a political question. Should we regulate how technology is used? And I would start with, yes, of course, people must have a voice in how these tools are used. And yes, sometimes government regulation can be a part of that answer. But controlling how technology is used is also very much an underlying economic question that regulation cannot fix on its own. So we can frame this question in terms of interlinked institutions that often predetermine who reaps the benefits of innovation, of technology. Why does technological innovation these days threaten us rather than benefit us? It's not a function of technology, it's systemic. So a capitalist economy using market allocation will always push for growth. There's nothing radical about that observation. It's how it's built. So capitalism, and specifically the market, pushes for growth and profits so that technology becomes an innovation that increases profit for the few at the expense of many. Whether it's AI cutting costs while then leading to unemployment, or algorithms selling more products while simultaneously infringing on our privacy and even our mental health. Regulation is a political decision that is implemented to contain or counter what our economic system would otherwise produce. So when we call for social, economic, and climate justice, government is often summoned as a regulator, stepping in to change these economic outcomes. So yes, we can use government to regulate outcomes, but when we see that our economic system continually produces a pattern of outcomes that we don't desire, why not also change the economic system itself? If technological innovation continually serves the powerful at the expense of everyone else, we should change that system that reproduces this effect. So here's another example of going beyond regulation. We've realized that our planet cannot sustain unlimited growth, so we try and use government regulation to limit certain growth. But the economy will continue to push back against those regulations unless we also restructure our economic system so that growth is no longer a necessary outcome or feature of the system. In the case of technological innovation, it's no different. So if we decide we don't want to allow corporate monopolies of internet service providers, or we don't want to allow Facebook to sell our data, or platforms to use algorithms to monetize our children, or any other profitable yet socially undesirable outcome, we can use government regulation to step in and put a stop to what the market will otherwise continue to reward and reproduce. But we need to go further. Using government regulation in this way is necessary and good for the short term, but it's imperative that we not mistake this tactic for our long-term strategy by looking at regulation itself as the end goal. Regulation is really just a band-aid on our way to curing the disease. Following a more comprehensive vision towards fundamental and lasting change, if we simply regulate big tech and stop there, we've not actually created any kind of resilient scenario in which technology will all of a sudden now equitably benefit everyone. The same underlying structures are still going to exist, and the market is still going to reward bargaining power and pressure for growth, pushing back against our regulations. So this is why we continually find ourselves as activists fighting the same uphill battle again and again and again. Yes, we must hold our government accountable to people rather than corporations. And yes, our government must implement regulations that both protect people from corporate power and that protect innovation itself from becoming merely just another tool of the powerful. So when we go further and our end goal is not regulation, or even just to hobble big tech, we can see that these are merely strategies towards the goal of actually building up better institutions of both polity and economy. What more can we do? Organizing for interlinked reforms like net neutrality, open source platforms, and then even further, the creation of a commons out of big tech, out of internet service providers, all while applying similar pressure to the finance and banking sectors, continually campaigning against corporations serving government policies, building up participatory government infrastructure, implementing more participatory planning for our economic allocation. These are all things that will help us tip the balance of power and actually create lasting change. So our end goal is fundamentally new institutions that actually elevate our values so that all the innovation, all the new technology that we create, in general, all the effort, talent, skill, and resources that we expend elevate and reinforce these values.
And so when you step back and envision the big picture changes, How do you see those unfolding? Is this a 100-year process? How can a shift occur?
That's a good question. I also don't have the be all end all answer for, of course. But how I look at it is, yes, of course, I'd rather it be a 1 year plan as opposed to a 100-year plan. But that doesn't exactly change the practical steps forward that we need to take as far as how long is this going to take. The answer is still the same. We need to proceed strategically and remember all these interconnections and link things back to their systemic causes so that we're not just chasing symptoms endlessly while not finding any cure. For example, there's a lot of work on the ground in terms of building a mass movement, whether it's coming up against how technology is used or more broadly to raising, in Real Utopia, we call it consciousness raising. It's kind of a political term, but just raising the level of awareness of everybody of, okay, I'm unhappy with X, Y, and Z. Well, why does it have to be this way? How does the system work? And what is a viable, different way to do it? A lot of times people will look back in history for examples, but I think a lot more work needs to be done for us to come together and become better communicators to build this mass movement that is needed to kind of forget a lot of the squabbles of the past and just keep looking ahead and saying, okay, well, what do we actually want? And how can we build institutions that will produce those desired outcomes? I find that that is something that brings people together rather than being divisive. We need to build a mass movement. If it's not grassroots, if it doesn't have massive popular involvement, it's not really going to get anywhere or have sticking power. And it's not going to practice what we preach. It's not going to be representative of the value that we're talking about of being more democratic, more participatory. We don't need to have an overnight revolution in order to put a lot of these concepts in practice. For example, when we call for a minimum wage, we're not just satisfied with people being paid $15 or whatever the amount we're asking for, but we're actually seeking is equity. We're seeking self-management in the workplace. So we need to constantly contextualize the reforms that we're working on in this broader scope of our vision, strategically move from one to the next. If we land at minimum wage, we should also try and include in that legislation or that union contract better working conditions, possibly even working towards worker ownership instead of private ownership. The question of when is this going to happen and how far away are we from it, it's really impossible to say. But what I do know is that it doesn't actually matter and the timeline will be shortened as long as we proceed strategically.
Celia, what are your thoughts on the polarization between people that's happening today?
The really toxic division is between those who take essentially a pharmaceutical-based, almost religious view of the human body versus those who are steeped in what sometimes gets called alternative health, but I don't really like that term. It's classical virology and biology, classical notions about what it means to stay healthy, to get healthy once you're sick. Those were all turned upside down and inside out to accommodate both HIV/AIDS and COVID. So my big question, and the big question of a lot of people in my life, I have many friends on the left. I have many friends on the right. I have Christian friends. I have secular friends. I have libertarian friends, colleagues, people I speak to. And what's really bedeviling people now is what caused this immense rift, especially on the left, where one side, and that includes Noam Chomsky, it includes Naomi Klein, it includes many icons of the left, where they said, we're going with the state apparatus and the orthodox media. No measures are too extreme to control COVID. They were pro-mask, they were pro-vaccines, they were pro-vaccines with no safety or efficacy testing. They were pro-mandates, many of them. Very few distinctions were made for where this pharmaceutical agenda might be questioned at all. And that's incredibly surprising because I would say to those people, including Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, anybody else, I would say this virus apparatus is an outgrowth of the military, and it is of the military. The Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, these are military institutions. So this is the new war front, our bodies. We all know that the way you go to war, the warmongers need an enemy. They create an enemy. The media foments the notion of that enemy. And now everybody's ready to go to war. So the virus, all of virology which is disintegrating as we speak. There are a lot of amazing minds who are deconstructing the whole notion of viruses as pathogens and viruses even as entities. But a lot of our dominant figures in the culture are extremely disdainful of all of these discussions. And I think they're missing the path forward out of tyranny back to freedom. I think they're missing it altogether because in their minds, somehow they equate everything medical that's different from everything we've ever understood about the military-industrial complex, the fake wars, Iraq, Libya, Syria. People who were clear about those atrocities cannot see that this is yet another atrocity engineered by and coming from essentially the neocon mentality and the American war machine.
How does this connect to developing and maintaining a democratic society?
I don't think we can have a democratic society if we can't have science that's uncoupled from big, big money. Not just money, but AIDS is a $2 trillion industry. I think COVID became a $2 trillion industry in its first 6 months or something. These are vast amounts of money that kills democracy because what you have is people stating their views based on Bill Gates funds all the mainstream media. It's in the tax returns on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation homepage. You can just read it. All the media that they fund. So we have to follow the money. This is a big task, but admit that this globalist money has been soaking all of our institutions in propaganda, which has meant that they've had free reign to rule the culture, like a kind of rulership that I don't know if we've ever seen, because it's not even going to stop in the next election. There's nothing that stops it. It becomes the absolute dominant paradigm. So the way I see it, the pharmaceutical industry, which is not quite the right word for it, they're criminals. I agree with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is a criminal cartel, and they have corrupted all of our institutions. All of our institutions are captured and at their beck and call. We cannot come out of this unless we have a separation of church and state, unless we have a separation of pharmaceutical church and state, meaning if you see somebody on the television set who's speaking about COVID, it should be at the bottom of the screen exactly how much money they've taken from pharmaceutical companies and grants. Same for the channel you're watching, and so on and so on and so on. Transparency. We don't have any of that. We don't have any of that. Other countries, I would say virtually every country is better than we are in the United States because we have really just become, I think, a captured pharmaceutical slum. And I don't think our founding fathers could have anticipated that there would be a threat like this that would render all of us prey, even our children, to profit motives and control motives.
Alexandria, would a popular mass movement that calls for the expansion of democratic infrastructure and a democratic economy be worthwhile? And would such a movement even be able to survive in a context of rapidly accelerating technology?
Your question made me smile. Worthwhile, I think, might be the understatement of the century. On a semantic note, I prefer the word participatory in place of democratic just because it implies not only representation, but individual agency, collective deliberation, social collaboration. But I do think we're really talking about the same movement here. So yes, a popular mass movement for the expansion of more democratic participatory infrastructure and economy is not only worthwhile, it's essential. And in fact, it's existential. It is really the road that leads to a future that answers the question, what do you want? And I want to live in a more democratic participatory society, a society organized to produce equity, solidarity, diversity, and self-management, where social benefits are maximized and the environment is not just some silent, dead externality. Frankly, in the very immediate sense, I just want to live and envision younger people living on after me, free from corporate stranglehold and the worst possibilities of climate collapse. In terms of movement, I really like the way you framed this question to be inclusive of complementary spheres of society. So our polity on the one hand is how we collectively practice decision-making and how we implement those choices. And then we also have our economy, which is how we organize production, consumption, and allocation. And these are pretty significant features of any organized society. So yes, absolutely, it's worthwhile for a mass movement to call for increased participatory infrastructure in both polity and economy. And in fact, we must also call for increased participatory features in the spheres of kinship and community, because any gains we make in one sphere are going to help complement, support, and reinforce similar gains in all the other spheres of life. Each reform is meant to create an opportunity for more reforms and also to enforce and strengthen all the previous reforms across all the spheres of life. So the second half of your question, how such a movement specifically relates to the rapid acceleration of technology, is really interesting and important because the changes that emanate from innovation are in fact so rapid. We can see the history in the US where productivity has increased exponentially since the 1970s, yet the work week is not shorter and wages have stagnated. The increased productivity due to all the various innovations and technologies has increased shareholder profit, it's increased growth, but it has not benefited workers, it has not benefited communities, and certainly not the environment. But this is really just a logical and expected outcome for capitalism to produce. So if technology will bolster and enhance whatever system it enters into, then what we really need is not more or less technology, but a new system. And technology will always fall into the hands of the powerful, and they will use it for their own ends. So why not empower people and move from competitive power hierarchies into more collaborative horizontal network? A popular mass movement that calls for the expansion of participatory infrastructure and a participatory economy recognizes that these institutions and even entire economic systems are human products. They're changeable, they're not naturally occurring, and they're not inevitable. So this mass movement can finally answer the question of, okay, you don't like the way of the world, then what do you want? What we want is to strategically move forward on a trajectory towards a worthy vision and change the world completely. And our struggle in doing this must be participatory and holistic. Specifically, as a primary organizing strategy, we should be seeking ways to disrupt and end the corporate control over people's lives, and with it, the really existential stranglehold on our ecological responsiveness. We should simultaneously be seeking ways to disrupt and end all forms of authoritarianism, inequality, patriarchy, racism, classism together. And in doing this, we need to be treating technology as a tool. Technology can help us fight, disrupt, organize, and experiment. It cannot show us loyalty. It's a thing. So we must really prioritize fighting systems.
And now for part 2, the real F-bomb. The F in this case stands for fascism. So let's light the fuse with some words from Henry Wallace, quoted in chapter 1. Wallace was a journalist, farmer, and businessman who served as Vice President of the United States under President Franklin Roosevelt. In 1944, Wallace wrote, "If we define American fascists as one who, in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, then there are undoubtedly several million fascists in the United States." He explained that, quote, "The American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information." Aaron, there are a lot of similarities between what we see today, like unemployment, insecurity, frustration with governments that don't act on behalf of the people, and with what was happening in the 1930s and 40s when fascism rose throughout Europe. How do you think we should address the rise of contemporary fascism on the right or the left?
Right. That is a very, very important question because I'm a social scientist. That means we fixate upon definitions of words and what really is the important part of a term that you're going to discuss and try to debate. Well, what really is the essence of fascism? Fascism is the merger of state and corporate power, and it is a capitalist attempt to have revolution from above and to stave off revolution from below. So why did the German elites, who weren't all raving anti-Semitic lunatics like Hitler, why did they support Hitler? And it was because the conditions were ripe for a socialist revolution in that country. And it was that Germany where Marx himself said socialism would arise. He saw the conditions being right there in terms of having a very large and productive class of proletariat that was properly industrialized such that you could have socialism. And he saw this arising that way. He saw this as a progression where you had to go from feudalism to capitalism. And at some point, the workers would say, we are actually the productive force in this economy, and the economy should be run for our benefit to take care of human needs. But this is a prospect that terrifies the capitalists. And so that's where fascism comes from. That's why people among the British and American elite supported people like Mussolini and people like Hitler and the Nazis. And it's why elements of the German ruling class, who were not like Hitler, still supported the Nazis to some extent, because he was going to do what was necessary to protect the hegemony of the ruling class. That meant that he would kill the people that needed to be killed. He didn't first start out rounding up the Jews. They went after the leftists. They went after labor leaders, socialists, communists. They staged the Reichstag fire, blame it on a communist. That's what seems to have happened. It's funny that it's still disputed today. It's the one case where some liberals will want to defend the Nazis and say, no, they didn't do that. They didn't stage the Reichstag fire. Well, there's a good reason to believe that they did, and that's worth contemplating. So that's what fascism is. Fascism is a lawless regime to protect capitalism. You have to have capitalism to have fascism too. That would be another way to look at things chronologically. So other forms of absolutism are not fascism. You can't say Genghis Khan was a fascist even if you don't like Genghis Khan. Fascism is a different thing. So do we have a kind of fascism today already is a question to ask. And people like Sheldon Wolin wrote an article, and he was just pointing out that this system is an inverted totalitarian system, because instead of mobilizing the population for specific national goals, it demobilizes them and it fragments them and befuddles them and uses a sort of divide and rule approach. So we already have two corporate parties and militarism in place. The main fundamental pillars of fascism, you can say, have emerged in the United States. Whether you really want to say, well, the U.S. is categorically fascist or not is kind of beside the point. We should be worried about how our circumstances parallel the 30s and 40s, because in the 30s and 40s in the United States, you had a strong enough labor movement and a ruling class that was sober enough that they could say, we would be better off reforming the system somewhat rather than risking a revolution that could destroy everything. So in the balance of power in the end was enough that more liberal forces were able to hold sway in terms of the capitalist elite, which doesn't mean very far to the left. It was more rational that they did that. And even then, you still had people in America who wanted to overthrow Roosevelt and called him a class traitor and thought he was a Bolshevik. The business plot where they tried to get Smedley Butler to lead the Bonus Army and other people to take power and put a junta in charge of the United States in some way, a corporate frontman. It's not that by defeating Trump, we've defeated fascism. The elements that would comprise the core of fascism in the United States are already in the driver's seat. You wonder what's restraining them. And it would seem to be that they need some democratic legitimacy. And so they have to contrive ways to be more fascistic maybe, or capitalize on different crises to move in a more fascist way. They can't mobilize the population the way the Nazis did, and they're not even attempting to. They're actually more dividing and scaring everyone in different ways, and further dividing and subdividing people and groups to maintain their hold on power. It's important to recognize the parallels between the 30s and 40s, and also how our own situation is different. And we can't assume that what happened with FDR is going to happen today. And it definitely is not happening with Biden. Let's recall that he said, if you elect me, nothing will fundamentally change. That was his way of convincing the party's owners, the funders, that he was their man. So why would we be surprised when that comes to pass? Why would we take his public pronouncements at face value when it does seem like he's keeping his promise to the elite that he made before he came to power? So these are things we got to look at it, be soberly examined, and then think of how to proceed, because you can't really solve the problem if you're in denial about it, or if you want to have some happy version that is less grim so that you can pretend that that's the reality, because that to me seems to be where we're at.
In 1938, US President Franklin Roosevelt said, "The first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in essence, is fascism, ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power." Mark, how does this relate to the current rise of corporate wealth and trillionaires, and how can it be addressed practically?
It relates directly to the way we live now. We now live with difficulty, and the difficulty is becoming ever more obstructive and restrictive. And this is all because of the evolution of our system into one that can only be described as fascist. In 1980, there was a book published by Bertram Gross called Friendly Fascism, which made the argument that we were already then living under fascism, but of a comparatively benign kind that was not dependent on the services of brown shirts, and the police were not kicking in everybody's doors, etc. I think that's a very good book. I actually revived it in a series I was editing called The Forbidden Bookshelf, which brought back important writings that had slipped out of print. What I think has happened since 1980 is that the system has gradually become more and more one that we can describe as unfriendly fascism. First of all, government today is inextricable from the private sector. And this isn't just national governments, but an emerging globalist government. The World Health Organization, for example. Actually, the World Health Organization is an excellent example of what I'm talking about because it is, on the one hand, ostensibly a disinterested nonprofit global entity affiliated with the UN whose purpose is to safeguard the health and well-being of humankind worldwide. But in fact, the World Health Organization is heavily involved with private players like Bill Gates, who provides more of its funding than any other entity, I think, except the US government. And it's also involved with big pharma, as is the CDC, as is the FDA. These agencies have much of their budget provided to them by pharmaceutical companies, which is breathtaking to me. I'm still not used to it. But it's the kind of thing that Roosevelt was warning against and that is now an established fact. The euphemism for this sort of thing is public-private partnerships. But that's really just a euphemism for fascism, because fascism, which, as Mussolini told us, could also be termed corporatism, represents the merger of state and corporate power. That's what we now have. And it isn't only the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry that have combined into one thing. But we also now see corporate journalism inextricable from big tech, and all of it becoming ever more contemptuous of free speech and democratic argument. It is now pretty much impossible to contradict the prevailing propaganda narratives in any forum that has an audience of any kind. I mean, I've been shadow banned on Facebook and on Twitter. I can no longer publish in any known journal, as I used to publish in many of them, and wrote op-eds for the Times and was often on NPR. All of that is over. I now post my writings on Substack. And in that regard, I'm like an awful lot of other people who aren't part of the propaganda choir that seems to fill every space and every head. Now, I've talked about public-private partnerships, and then I mentioned NPR. So I should note that while the corporate media has become part of a new fascist order, publicly supported media has also been compromised by big money, so that the BBC in Britain and the CBC in Canada, although nominally public broadcasters, are heavily subsidized by the BBC by the Gates Foundation. And they also both take money from corporations, from big pharma. And let me add another consideration that while these commercial media outlets have all joined governments to impose a particular narrative on everybody, and as the corporate media has become more concentrated, so that some 5 transnational corporations are now responsible for some 90% of all the content we take in. As that has happened, the whole juggernaut has also become even closer to what we call the deep state, to the government, the CIA, to the military. and so on, to the CDC, to the FBI. Now, this kind of thing was already starting to happen way back in the 50s, but over the decades, I think that relationship has tightened so that we are now living in a de facto totalitarian system. When I read the New York Times, for example, which I try not to do too often, when I happen to glance at it, or just look at the offerings from any or all of the corporate media and the left press, for that matter, I am struck by how all of it is really identical to what George Orwell was describing satirically in 1984. It's just big lie after big lie, gobsmacking lies, lies that are so false it kind of takes your breath away. And if you call this to their attention, if you fact check them and send them evidence that what they said is false, even if it's something you personally can attest to, they don't care. They ignore you. They issue no retraction. And indeed, who's going to do anything about it? What is one going to do about this? So I think that Roosevelt was absolutely right to warn of this danger. He had no way of knowing that the danger was ultimately going to loom right here and not just in the Axis countries.
And of course, the follow-up is there anything that can be done about what's going on today?
Well, I am a great believer in the possibility of solutions to these problems, but I am challenged to identify specific ones because we're in uncharted territory now. We've never really been here before. We've never been in the clutches of a global propaganda drive or a number of propaganda drives that are global in scope. I'm not the only person who was startled by the instantaneous shift from COVID, vaccine to Ukraine. In the twinkling of an eye, we just went from one narrative to the other, and the same people who were fanatically convinced by the first were now fanatically convinced by the sequel. It's really amazing. Now, the solution to this has been, and promises to be, alternative means of spreading the contradictory word. That's one way of making a larger point, which is responsive to your question, and that is this. Things have gotten so bad, the corruption is so advanced, the threat to democracy is so dire, and the danger is so great that we now have to think in terms of rebuilding our essential democratic institutions. There is no solution that can reclaim the institutions that are corrupt beyond remedy. There is no way to reclaim the medical establishment, which is affiliated with the pharmaceutical industry and the hospital industry. It is irredeemably corrupt. Journalism. There is no way to reclaim the extant institution of journalism. It is simply too far gone, even though it doesn't have much of an audience anymore. They've all lost many of their readers or viewers. CNN doesn't even have 1 million people a night watching it, whereas Joe Rogan will have 12 million people watching him. This tells us that we have to rebuild journalism to bring the discussion home to where I sit. Academia is also irredeemably corrupt for a number of reasons. It is far too costly for nearly everybody to afford, and it provides an education that's really basically useless. It's just basically woke indoctrination. And it's just not worth the price of admission. So we need alternatives. We need new colleges, new universities. Now, a lot of this is enabled by the internet, which on the one hand has helped create the nightmare we're living in, but at the same time offers us some ways out of it and provides dissidents with the means of finding an audience and speaking to one another. So it's a double-edged sword. And I think that it will continue to be used that way and should be, though at the same time, we also have to recreate institutions that are dependent on face-to-face communication, in-person medical visits, for example, and news publications that are printed on paper and that can be passed from hand to hand, and colleges and universities and high schools where students can meet in person with professors and so on. Those are far more human ways of functioning. And it's not coincidental that all those kinds of experience, that kind of social interaction, that kind of face-to-face encounter is precisely what Bill Gates and the rest of them are trying to eliminate in their push to move everything online. And that's all part of their larger economic project, destroying small and independent businesses, replacing them with Amazon or big box stores. And this is something that was already clear to many of us just a few months into the COVID crisis. And I think that that's the agenda, and it's one that we have to do everything we can to fight. So it's a big answer to your question, right? That we have to rebuild these institutions. In the meantime, we have to find ways to resist this trend that's being imposed on all of us. And it will probably require more prodigious protests like the truckers' protest in Canada and the one that they attempted in this country and that have been attempted in actually a number of countries, although most people don't know this. I think we have to make a stand for the use of cash, because a key part of this whole project is the elimination of cash and its replacement with digital currency, which could conceivably mean game over, because that will subject every single transaction in our lives to constant surveillance and scrutiny and approval by some kind of central banking system. And that is an excellent way to silence inconvenient voices by denying them access to their funds. So I wish I could be a little more precise in answering your question, but I'm trying to give you a larger sense of the kind of thing we have to do.
Aaron, in the best of all possible worlds, how would we proceed?
It's easy to say things that I would like to see happen, but as far as how to get there, I don't really know. I think people need to become more aware of the nature of the problem and the fundamental core of it being this massive concentration of economic power that cannot but coincide with a massive concentration of political power. When you have three major financial firms that have a controlling interest in basically every industry, so BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And then their capital management funds. Peter Phillips writes about all these things in his book, Giants, the Global Power Elite. When you have that much economic power, and the owners might be more dispersed, a small class of rich people, they're small, but they're not as small as the number three. But the managers of these funds are wielding enormous amounts of power. And this is totally antithetical to any democratic understanding of how a civilization might be organized. There has to be some recognition that this is unworkable and will only lead to dystopian, tyrannical outcomes. It's hard to imagine it not going in that direction. Now, how we got here is the question that I devote a lot of my book to, and it deals with history and a lot of the history that people try to forget. History that is often obscured. So I think that you look at events like the assassinations of the 60s, where there were political elements of progressive nature that were snuffed out systematically. The John Kennedy assassination is key. He seemed to be wanting to end the Cold War, and he seemed to recognize that the Cold War was this massive structural impediment to anything positive that he wanted to do. So he gave his peace speech. He talked about normalizing relations. When he gets killed, RFK and Jackie send an emissary to Russia and say, look, peace is now up to you guys because Lyndon Johnson is too close to big business elements and other elements. So he's not going to pursue peace. But if Robert Kennedy gets into the White House, then the quest for peace will be back on. Obviously, Robert doesn't get into the White House. And the King assassination, when he wanted to have his own version of the bonus army, except it was a poor people's campaign and they were going to camp out in Washington, but he gets assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated when he had become more moderate in some ways. I don't want to call him a moderate, but he dropped some of the more unreasonable aspects of the Nation of Islam, where it was just white people are full on the devil. There's a lot of gripes you can have about white people, and I understand why he felt that way, given his experiences and so on. But he essentially, when he died, was more or less in the same place as Martin Luther King when he died. And that's not just me saying that. James Baldwin made the same comments about them both in retrospect. So this is a murderous element of the state that, when it comes down to it, will kill leaders rather than allow democracy to run its course. And so that's the kind of regime that we're dealing with. And I think that being the case, you have to confront it and acknowledge it. So some kind of truth and reconciliation process in the United States, perhaps with amnesty for state criminals, if need be, would be necessary to move forward. I also think that the state secrecy in itself is very problematic, and it allows for a covert totalitarian rule. It appears to be a democracy, but people that can break the law with impunity, which I call this exceptionism, meaning that the state operates in a realm of exception, like Carl Schmitt said Germany should do back in the day, that we have that, only we deny it. And the control of secrets and the secrecy system of our government is a major component of that. So that system needs to be overhauled. The public state or the democratic state, democratic officials should be in charge of secrets and state secrecy. People might not know this, but two presidents, Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, specifically tried to pry secrets of the JFK assassination out of the CIA and were stymied. Okay, so who is really running the country if that is the case? And I'm not saying it's the CIA. The CIA is capitalism's invisible army. They were created at the behest of capitalist forces, and they operate to the benefit of the ruling elite in the United States, the satellite capitalist ruling class around the world. America maintains that system, and the CIA is its secret army, basically. So some kind of opening up of our actual history would, I think, be a way to affect a major political change. I personally think that, because I think that in part by looking at how the state responds to these things. Look at how they responded to Oliver Stone when his movie came out in 1991, JFK. They lambasted him and called him all sorts of names. The prestige media did, and so on. The New York Times, Washington Post, they attacked him. They attacked him before the movie even started filming. That to me says that the establishment knows that that crime was an establishment crime, and that were it to be openly discussed, it would delegitimize this system. And so their prime directive is to stop that from happening, which is why they did what they did to Oliver's film in 1991. And now with the new film, it's mostly a blackout. They're not even bothering to attack it because I think they learned their lesson that it actually increased the publicity of it. The new film is devastating in terms of pointing out how the official story is totally untenable, really. The major tenets of it are not supportable, given the evidence that's emerged in the years since then. So the emperor has no clothes, but nobody's going to know that because we have a mediated reality, and the media is not going to inform them of this. But I do think that if enlightened elements of the establishment recognized the grim future that we're heading towards and how we got here, perhaps a great opening up, a real American glasnost could be the start or a major step towards making the very fundamental reforms that we need to if we're going to have a decent society and a healthy civilization, and to not blow up the world, because there's also the issue of nuclear war and global warming that loom over us all. Dr. Strangelove has got to be one of the most prophetic and prescient films ever made, because the logic that you see among these people really does lead to nuclear war. It almost killed everybody in 1962. It's just luck that it didn't. And the U.S. with these confrontations over China could be heading towards the same thing. And we should resist that however we can. I can't give a perfect answer as to how that's going to happen, but it's really important that we should. And if we recognize that and more people recognize that, that's got to be a start. So that's what I would say we'd have to do.
Lena, in the 1930s and 40s, many capitalists weren't too concerned about democracy. On the whole, they preferred authoritarians to fascists, but fascists were better than socialists. How would you relate this to what's happening today?
I don't really have a reference for a setup where capitalism, as represented by market forces, has had to deal with democratic governance in the context I'm coming from. It has always been one or another form of dictatorship under the guise of ballot box-based democracy, but we're really not talking about anything that is near a democratic practice. This is not just limited to the current administration. It also extends to include the pre-revolutionary governments that we've lived through in Egypt. And throughout all these years, we have seen a formidable marriage of business and politics in such ways that I think provided very important early insight, the kind of insights that actually restricted environments, political environments can offer to the more enlightened democratic world. And that is that actually capitalism works very well in restricted environments, even if it presents itself through the discourses, or at least the rhetoric of individual freedoms, of openness, of participation, from the Facebook culture of express yourself all the way to the startup culture of defend your idea and you will be able to make money out of it. So I feel this intricate relationship of authoritarianism and capital, it has provided the world with a formidable insight about how we shouldn't treat the state and the market as binary, actually. Even though with some rational thinking, you might bring the market closer to the people because it's not a one-headed type of structure the way the state is. But in reality, as a power structure, it is something that revolves around the state. And I would say, thanks to authoritarian contexts, we could have access to this insight earlier on in many ways. I mean, what does it mean to democracy, which is your initial question, is first to take stock of this reality, again, to deconstruct what capital is about, especially in its new configuration, in its attempt to entangle itself with social causes, with social responsibility, and so on, to unpack that, to bring it back to where it belongs, which is it being a power structure, and to start operating from a place of criticality. I would say criticality and insight are what we gain from realizing this intricate relation between capital and state, especially from authoritarian contexts.
So, what do you see as the options and possibilities for the future in Egypt?
It's very hard to talk about tangible ways out or tangible solutions because in the very specific reality I live in, we're still in this optic of a very strong entanglement of capital and the state, in the sense that also we are in a situation where the state controls capital and capital doesn't have much of a chance to operate if it's not aligning itself to the state in a way or another. So in a context like this, what can we do is on the day-to-day level, how can we be more cognizant of economic powers or sub-powers or counter-powers that are operating outside this hegemonic structure of the state? So informal laborers, local businesses, initiatives like this, how can we be more aware of these and sort of engage with it as potential infant economies that we know will never stand a chance to scale or to become big in any form or way with the repression that we're living through, but at least being cognizant, being aware in the way we live with what types of economy surrounds us is an important thing to do, is an important possibility. I mean, when you say possibility, I think also of the sheer size of the population as a possibility, because what possibility lies when you have a huge amount of people, a lot of them are young people, is basically that all of these young people will engage in different types of economic activities, and it would only be the minority of them who would be able to be engaged in the formal sector that is totally controlled by the state. So how can we observe what else is there, knowing that the possibility of many other things outside the scope of the formal is very much there by the sheer fact that there are many of us here. In a nutshell, I see possibility in the people, in the volume of the people who are here. And I feel that a lot of sub-powers and counter-powers are possible. Yeah, the people, basically.
Mark, we're in a moment of intense polarization in politics and society. Is there anything that can lessen divisiveness, create greater unity, and actually promote a democratic society?
That's a key question. The answer is to demonstrate to people who their real enemy is and to make them understand the all-importance of unity among the have-nots. And by the have-nots, at this point, I don't just mean poor people. I mean those who are not multi-billionaires and trillionaires someday. The polarization you speak of has been deliberately advanced for a very long time. The strategy of divide and conquer goes all the way back to the Romans, if not even further back into the past. That's the expression divide and conquer comes from the Latin divide et impera. The Romans understood that you cement your own authority by sowing seeds of discord between the populations you dominate. They were masters at this, and the British were masters at this. We look at Ireland and Northern Ireland today. We look at India and Pakistan today. Those attest to the savvy of the British. Even when they leave as imperial overlords, they make sure that some parts of their former colony are at odds with the other part. And the same thing has been happening under the auspices of the United States. The intelligence agencies did everything they could starting in the 60s to divide the left, infiltrate, penetrate, and divide the left. And now, under globalist dominance, we see that division has been pushed more aggressively than ever before. Let's look back at the COVID crisis just for a moment as an example. While panicking the majority with the specter of the coronavirus, virus. By that, I don't mean there is no such thing, but I do mean that its lethality was grossly exaggerated. While terrorizing the population with biofascist exaggerations and lies, there was also a marked effort to divide the population first between maskers and anti-maskers. So either you were wearing your mask or you weren't, and there was tremendous hostility between the two sides. And as far as the media was concerned, it was always and only the anti-maskers who were the violent ones, who were the dangerous ones. Whereas in fact, as anyone who tried not to wear a mask can tell you, those without masks on felt far more beset and attacked, and for good reason, than people who were wearing masks. Well, that was a kind of dress rehearsal, so to speak, for the rift between vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, right? Those who weren't vaccinated and those who were. But before that even happened, the division was intensified in the middle of 2020 by the George Floyd moment, where there were protests all over the country, immediately followed by very violent riots, arson, vandalism, shootings, etc., that on the one hand had the salutary effect, as far as the globalists were concerned, of dealing a further body blow to the independent economy, especially Black-owned businesses in that case. But it also deepened division. It deepened division between red and blue, and that division is wide as it's ever been. And this continued through January 6th, which the so-called left and the media all cast preposterously as an attempted coup, as if they didn't know what an attempted coup really is and what it really entails. But this was not just divisive, but it had the effect of casting the other side as seditious and dangerous and terroristic. And now with Ukraine, we're seeing the same thing, although the Ukraine hysteria has tended to unite a lot of Republicans with Democrats in their war fever against Russia. Well, what do we do about this? While we're not paying attention, while we're focused on Ukraine, just as while we were focused on vaccination, we were not noticing the preparations for the Great Reset. We were not noticing the move towards digital currency. We weren't noticing the ways in which democratic governance and constitutional proprieties had been eliminated over the previous couple of years. Since the rollout of the virus, there was no more due democratic process for determining health policy. It was all dictated by fiat from on high. The Constitution was in tatters by 6 months into the COVID crisis. So the point is, we cannot allow our gaze to be diverted from its proper object, which is our own well-being, our own survival, and how an extremely wealthy and powerful globalist elite has been engaged in attempting to destroy us, to enslave us. I can't really think of anything that's more important than creating unity. There are two things that one should do that are both extremely dangerous to do. One is to cast a shadow on a prevailing propaganda narrative. You do that at your peril. Look where Julian Assange is and where he's been for years. Well, that's because he released things like Collateral Murder, the gunship footage from Iraq that showed that the war on terror was not this heroic Western enterprise, but a bloody mess and a horror. Any doctor who attempts to reach a public with a message that contradicts what the CDC claims is very likely to have his or her license revoked. I know 2 doctors who have had their licenses revoked for this kind of heresy. So it's dangerous to contradict the propaganda. Look what happened to me at NYU and what's happened to many, many others. The other thing that one must do that is maybe even more dangerous is to urge people to put their differences aside, whether they are racial, ethnic, economic, geographic, partisan. Put them aside, forget them, join hands, and focus on our common interests and understand who the real enemy is, so that we come to see that rather than being at each other's throats, we should be at their throats. And with that kind of unity, it seems to me, the solutions to this problem will become a lot more evident and a lot more feasible, because we won't be just a plurality that's struggling both with them and with everybody around us, but we will be a unified people, because we are many and they are few, to paraphrase Shelley. And so putting it in those basic terms is helpful and may help us understand the importance of alliances.
Thanks, Mark. And Alexandria, would you like to give us some final thoughts?
more solidarity among all of us who are seeking change and seeking a better world is absolutely imperative. And the flip side to that I often see as a barrier towards building a movement is we have this effect, and I've experienced it. I'm pretty sure everyone at some point has experienced it, where you just have this overwhelming sensation of, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Whether you've never gotten involved in activism or you're a seasoned activist, we all have these moments. So I think an organization like Real Utopia, and there's many out there locally and internationally, where it's more inviting and accepting of anyone. You don't need to arrive to this movement with accolades, degrees, experience. If you do, great. But my perception of what it's going to take to build a mass movement is that we should become more open and inviting to absolutely everyone who wants to get involved, and empower each other to know that even if you think you can't do anything, you can. And just by joining a group of people who also want to do better and starting a conversation, whether it's in a formal activist network or just over coffee, just getting that conversation going is going to start and inspire change. And we can really help each other in knowing what to do. I guess the message is just, yes, more solidarity. And if you think you can't do anything, talk to somebody else, because you can, and get the conversation going.
Thank you so much for joining us for 2 Minutes to Midnight, an extravaganza. And a huge thanks to our guests, Lena Atala, Celia Farber, Aaron Good, Mark Crispin Miller, and Alexandria Shana. We really appreciate everyone who subscribes to Catalista on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus interviews. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoyed 2 Minutes to Midnight, please add, comment, and like us on your favorite podcast platform. Are you a creative in any medium or field? How does 2M2M inspire you? Create and share your work, and we'll post it at catalista.net. And think about taking part in the worldwide live extravaganza. Visit 2M2M on catalista.net for details, and get a few chapters from People Get Ready. This episode of 2M2M was edited by Chris Sanders, Brian Behrens, Yanni Evans, and Tyler Costa. The mix is by Ben Sirokis. Sound design is by Darren Chorley. Our music is composed by John Askew, and the executive producers are Chicky Munch and Binny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbel. 2 Minutes to Midnight, an extravaganza, is proud to partner with Local Futures, a non-profit organization that's a pioneer in the worldwide localization movement. Visit them at localfutures.org. This is Henry Coleman signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you next time.